All right, welcome everybody. It looks like we're beginning to taper off in terms of people turning in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Big thank you to FCAT and to Chantel and the whole team for organizing what sounds like a really fantastic series of events. It's really encouraging to see how seriously you at FCAT are taking these issues, core issues of diversity and equity. Certainly something that we need to be following your lead on out here on the East Coast. My name is Ajay Parasram, and I'm a faculty member at Dalhousie University in the departments of International Development Studies and History, trained as a political scientist and political economist. And basically, a lot of my work is about anti-colonial history and the post-colonial present, colonial and post-colonial present. Obviously, you know, Alex and I wrote a book together. Thank you for reading the book, and thank you for sending your questions in advance. We have a good 20 questions that you've already submitted, and we will be taking your questions live and trying to do as best we can to kind of move through as many questions as possible. I'm gonna actually hand it off to my comrade Alex over here, who's gonna tell you a little bit about kind of our background, how we got started, and also what our process is, so you can understand kind of fundamentally, pedagogically, and politically what it is we're all about. So that's it for me for now. I'll pass it over to Alex.
Yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to the organizers for having us. My name is Alex Kasnabish. I am a faculty member in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Mount St. Vincent University. And I am the other half of Safe Space for White Questions. Yeah, thanks so much again for being with us here today. I'm not going to go into excruciating detail about our project because you've read the book, and we'll have an opportunity to model the process for you this afternoon. But just to give you a sense of where we come from and how we work, this process has emerged from a few years of thinking and working together between me and AJ around questions on social movement organizing, popular education, rising far-right activity, and race and racism. And this whole project actually emerged quite organically. Ajay and I sitting down and, angsting about the fate and state of the world over a drink or two, trying to think about what we could do that was going to be a useful intervention that movements or activists didn't seem to already be doing themselves. And so we came up with the seed for a Safe Space for White Questions. This was right before the emergency stage of the pandemic kicked in the spring, late winter of 2020. We decided that we were going to put together an in-person workshop or drop-in session, really, just aimed at the community, inviting people to come in, especially white-identified folks, because we thought there was a lot of good social movement, social justice organizing going on within movements involving racialized people, but not necessarily sort of inviting white identified folks into a conversation to ask what are sometimes difficult, challenging, or awkward questions in other spaces. And we thought that was something that we could contribute as educators, as organizers, as activists, and also take that burden a little bit off the plates of other racialized activists and organizers in the community. And of course, then the pandemic hit and everything got shut down, so we couldn't be in person anymore. And we decided, rather than abandon the idea, we thought we'd take it online. And I won't bore you with the iterations, but we struggled. We had some help. We were kind of exiled on university media sites, and then Fernwood Publishing stepped in, saw what we were doing, said they really liked it, but thought we could do it a lot better if we had some competent help. And we moved the show to YouTube. We have a wonderful production team at Fernwood Publishing who do all the bottom lining for us, so we don't have to mess around with things that we understand poorly, including promotion and technical support. And now all those episodes, as you probably have seen, are archived on our YouTube playlist on Fernwood Publishing's YouTube channel. We've got some developments in the works we might talk about during the course of the show, but I won't get into that right now. For now, YouTube is our home, and we have successfully broken the 20 episode mark a couple of episodes ago, I believe. Basically, the way the process works is this, and this is sort of what we wanted to communicate for today. Ajay and I both come into these sessions having not read your questions in advance. We think that's an important part of the process. Both of us obviously come to questions of race, racism, social justice, both from our own personal experience as racialized people, but also as academics and activists who work adjacently, sometimes within these areas. But we're not really coming to this as specialists, scholarly specialists in race and racism. That's not our role in these spaces. What we wanted to do is to bring a much more grassroots, common sense, open-hearted, and sometimes even humorous approach to very thorny questions of everyday experiences with race and racism. Aimed primarily at white identifying folks, but not exclusively. We have lots of different folks who come to our sessions, a lot of folks whose identity we don't know because they don't disclose. But obviously our intention is to engage people around these questions and just to invite and facilitate an open, dignified, but fairly unapologetic discussion around questions of race and racism. And so that's what we're going to do with you today. We're going to take your questions. The way that this works is, since Ajay is leading this session off, he's going to read the question and take it first, and then he's going to kick it over to me, and I'm going to take a shot at it. We're basically going to go back and forth like that. We try not to be too verbose with each question, but we are academics, and I know you're all familiar with that. So this is a a hazard of the profession. We do our best to get through as many as we can, but as part of the process, we do take the questions in their complexity and context. So if we take a little longer with some questions and less with others, please don't be offended. It's not a mark of how much we care about the question. We just do try to get through as much as we can. And if we don't get to your question today, we invite you to please pay attention to future episodes of Safe Space for White Questions, because we are happy to take those questions into future episodes and discuss them on then. So yeah, if you don't get to hear from us today, then rest assured we haven't forgotten about you. But that's us in a nutshell, I think. AJ, have I forgotten anything?
The only other thing I would add is we also, in this particular session, we have the option for you to ask questions live right here as well. So you can use the question and answer function, and that's only going to be visible to us here and not to the general public. So your anonymity will still be protected if you want to ask a question. And we're going to try wherever possible to take a little mix of questions between faculty and staff. So if you want to disclose if you're faculty and staff, then that'll help us do that, but you also don't have to. Sometimes the question speaks. So we'll try to take a mix of the live questions if more live questions come in. Otherwise, we've got almost 20 questions in the queue. So thank you very much for taking the time to do that. And I think we should, Alex, should we just start and then see how far we get at the hour? All right. So the first question comes to us from somebody that identifies as SFU staff member. And the question reads, our staff association recently negotiated a new contract, and one of the new benefits is 2 cultural days for Indigenous employees. In an info session about the contract, someone asked why these 2 extra days of leave are not given to all employees, and why one culture group is being given preference. How would you respond to this? And then a related question, so we'll take them together. The university was recently approved to hire a certain amount of Indigenous staff positions. How would you explain to someone why this is appropriate and not unfair? So thanks for the questions. To some extent, the second piece of the question, we cover a little bit in the book when we take up the issue of meritocracy. The idea behind the merit, because underscoring, why can we have jobs set aside for particular cultural groups, is the kind of understated assumption that we could otherwise have a meritocracy where everybody would compete equally and an equal footing, and then the best person gets the job. That's how we like to imagine society operates. I forget if I wrote about it in the book, but I have spent at times, 45 minutes sitting down with journalists trying to explain that really when we talk about priority hiring, and because we want to get Indigenous perspectives or Black perspectives or queer perspectives into influential roles in our various universities, what is actually happening is we're not trying to uplift and do a favor for somebody else. We are trying to address an institutional deficiency within the institution, within SFU in this case, within Dalhousie in my case. What has happened is that for hundreds of years, we've operated as if 95% white and like maybe 75% male staff and faculty was somehow an all right and fair distribution and reflection of power and privilege in society and ability, more importantly. So what I would always say is encourage people to remember that priority hirings like this is actually about addressing an institutional deficiency, and it is not about doing a favor for someone, because oftentimes when you hire somebody into these designated positions, we end up doing an extremely large disproportionate amount of work to carry the burden of representation. And I'm hopeful. I don't know. Obviously, I haven't read your collective agreement. Hopefully, they've taken some time to deal with this, and so that it won't be like that. But then the 2 cultural days for Indigenous employees, I would chalk that one up to, we have had, close to 200 years of, Christian supremacy in and across Canada, where we have literally organized all temporality around the idea of the birth of Jesus Christ. And I know obviously a lot of Indigenous people identify as Christian at this point for a variety of reasons, but I think we need to realize that our what we think is secularism in Canada is actually a disproportionate and systematic favoring of a Christian Western European worldview. So to my mind, if you pick if you give 2 cultural days to an Indigenous employee, that's like a very low level acknowledgement that actually there are other cosmologies in the world, and that should be recognized. These are not days off. Like cultural days are usually incredible work days. When I when I take Diwali off or something like that, it's usually because I'm cooking for 75 people, and it's not like people are not generally relaxing during this time. So anyway, I'll pass it off to Alex to comment, and we'll take up another question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. They're super important, as AJ has already pointed out. So there's a joke I think we use in the book that I'm going to repeat here. It goes something like, the last 500 years have been the greatest affirmative action program for white men ever, right? So like when people are upset about an attempt to address what Ajay has correctly, I think, identified as an institutional failure or an absence, it's actually also an important recognition that the dominant subject position in our society, in our sort of civilizational framework, has been allowed to set the standard for literally everyone else's existence. So in an effort to correct that, which, I think if you don't think that needs to be corrected, obviously that's another discussion we need to have. But in order to correct that, you have to extend a diversity of opportunities to other people, and not just in a cookie cutter way, right? It's great, as Ajay points out, you get December 25th off. We can all enjoy that, but to organize our holiday schedule, indeed our academic terms, around what are essentially religious days of celebration is a pretty big deal, I would think, right? So we don't organize ourselves around everybody else's, even the other world religions' holidays. But in a country, obviously, trying at some level to come to terms with its long, enduring, and shameful history of settler colonialism, I think it's an important recognition to say, yeah, we agree that the indigenous nations that preceded the existence of our institutions on these lands have a right to, their cultural traditions and their cultural work. With respect to hiring, I think this is a slam dunk for me in a lot of ways. Just look around you. Look around you and look at who's doing the teaching, look who's doing the administrating. And this isn't just like a shallow identity politic. This is also a question of class as well, right? What do our institutions reproduce? Whose social reality? Whose set of values? Whose assumptions? And how do you imagine that we could change our institutions to reflect the composition of our society in a more accurate way without setting aside positions to allow for that to happen? In part because, the whole myth of meritocracy obviously doesn't extend just to our credentials or just to hiring. It saturates our entire society. So there are incredible intergenerational effects of the systematic privileging, in this case of whiteness and maleness in our society, that don't just accrue to you in the scope of your own life, but double, triple, quadruple down through generations as your descendants benefit from your elevated health, your better education, your ability to accumulate wealth, all these kinds of things. So obviously that's tied to job opportunities too. So addressing these kinds of things is why the struggle against racism isn't even in the first place a moral one. It's first a material one. Back to you, AJ. Oh, you are muted, my friend.
You'd think, folks, you'd think after all these years. But anyway, there it is. So moving right along, the next question we have, the person doesn't identify with if they're faculty or staff, so we'll just take it as it is. Who's white? Whiteness is a bit flattened in your book. When Modern Warrior on TikTok announced, as if he were an expert on the subject, that if you are white presenting, you are white, he got slammed by white presenting folks who have indigenous heritage and other marginalizations. Can I say that I don't consider myself white? To many, I am white presenting, but due to the place of origin and accent, in some places I am also seen as non-white. Or is it not up to me? Who gets to decide this? Really important question, really confusing question. And I think that in order to bring some clarity to this, what I would start with is saying, whiteness is not a state of being. Yeah, you're not truly, you're not white in some kind of essential or biological way. Whiteness is a structural and a historical phenomena. So whiteness has always been a shifting target. And part of the problem around whiteness has been when people aspire to whiteness, right? And people have aspired to whiteness from lots of different localities, right? South Asian people, I would argue, as a South Asian person, have oftentimes one of the colossal mistakes within our population has been aspiring to whiteness. And there's lots written about this in terms of the brown Englishmen, of the colonial Raj period. Historically, and I imagine Alex will talk about this, it's kind of really in his wheelhouse. So, white looking people have always kind of aspired to whiteness. I'll probably just sum up my bit here and pass it to Alex by saying I had an argument with my 4.5-year-old daughter recently on this subject because we were driving home from the beach and she was playing with her best friend Nora, who is a beautiful blonde-haired, almost translucently white little girl. And my daughter says to me, "Nora is brown." And I'm like, no, man, Nora is white. What are you talking about? Nora's white. You can't say Nora's brown. And she was like, she's very light brown. And I was thinking about this. And as a 4.5-year-old who has not yet been indoctrinated into the various structural forms of power and distortions that are, patriarchy and race and what have you, she's very honestly looking at and saying, everybody is a shade of brown. That's true. But, what we have to grapple with, I think, is the fact that ultimately it's not only about self-identification. When I don't have a TikTok account, but I'm assuming when this person got called out, it's because it was a kind of poorly thought through comment that doesn't think about the various historical complexities of race, like the ways in which people have become fairer skin or darker skin, or even our obsession over that, like pigmentation is itself a kind of colonial rendering that many of us all over the world have internalized. It can be an incredibly violent thing to deny somebody's racial identity You know, especially if they're light skinned or whatever it is that they might be. Does this mean that we exist in some kind of postmodern utopia where everybody can just decree whatever it is that they are? I mean, I don't think so. Absolutely not. It's about your communities. It's about your historical experiences. It's about who identifies you as part of your community. I was asked, for example, when I started at Dal, whether or not I identified as Black and was invited to the Black Faculty Association. At the time, I didn't have an understanding well enough to know my own history, right, and to understand that the radical politics of Black power in the Caribbean, where I'm even from, has always included South Asian people in its understanding of Blackness. So I declined that invitation because I felt like I would be appropriating Blackness if I said yes to that. But as I've been reading my Walter Rodney and you know, some more readings on the subject, I'm realizing that the relationship between race and class and history is actually enormously valuable, and it tells us a lot about it. On the point of accents, I do think accents are a little bit of a different thing, in part because you know, lots of racialized people also have accents, right? Like accents is not a given thing. So somebody having a, you know, like a Russian accent is going to be discriminated in some sense, but if they don't speak, they're not going to be discriminated against on that basis of race. So in terms of whiteness and racialization, I think accents need to be kind of put aside and considered as a form of prejudice, but not necessarily a form of racism. But I'll pass it over to Alex to jump in on this one.
Yeah, great answer. I think very comprehensive. So I won't take too much time on this one, but it's an important question for sure. And I think, you know, it really reflects in a lot of ways the, you know, the kind of violence that's done to our ability to understand what race signifies in terms of like our social location and how it's made when we start to sort of like, you know, argue about how it makes us feel, which is completely relevant, obviously, but isn't actually doesn't do much to illuminate how it functions as a relationship of oppression in society, right? So, I first of all, I'd really recommend the work of a historian, David Roediger, who's an American historian. He's like one of the absolute experts on the history of whiteness and its construction in North America, particularly in the United States. And I mean, his books are just really mind-blowing in terms of the way he elaborates the construction of what it means to be white in the context of the settlement and occupation of North America. And in there, you know, he talked about the fact that when the Irish arrive, right, they're not regarded as white. They have to earn their whiteness by being deployed by other people who are seen as more authentically white. They're deployed against Black people and Chinese people in order to, you know, police those communities, and in so doing, earn their whiteness. Nobody's really white, just like nobody's really Black. I mean, as an anthropologist, I can 100% confidently say, and with the backing of the largest professional genetics association on the planet in the United States, that race is a social construct. There is no genetic basis for our belief in what we call race, especially this notion of skin tone, of melanin content in your skin somehow according with discrete human races. We've known this for a long, long time, actually. It's an old biological truth. And yet race persists and indeed is in some ways more powerful today, arguably, than it was, you know, even a few decades ago in certain ways. Certainly more part of the daily conversation, more part of this anxiety around people's self-identification and all kinds of problems around this notion of opting and opting out, right? I mean, the case of Rachel Dolezal again in the United States and this notion of transracialism, I won't get into right now, but it problematizes everything. I mean, I'd say as somebody who comes from a so-called mixed race background. My father was very, very dark from Burma. My mother, who's still alive, is very, very pale. I'm somebody who like occupies that weird space. So trust me when I say, like, growing up and still today, depending upon the time of year and how dark my skin is, or whether somebody reads my name before they hear me speak, they might identify me as either a racialized person or a white person, right? So I feel the frustration of that all the time. I feel that, that sort of anxiety, or that that lack of clear identification, of feeling of belonging, all that sort of stuff. But it doesn't sort of bother me about my identity, nor does it convince me that there's an authentic racialized identity I have out there to claim. All this stuff is an imposition of the world as I've been born into it, right? And all these things have to do with relations of power that organize our proximity to advantage, to wealth, to opportunity, to possibility, or to death, to oppression, to exploitation. And it's not the only thing that organizes it. Obviously, there are lots of age, ability, gender, sexuality, class, more and more and more, right? But race is an important category here, and it's deeply embedded in the structure of our modern world. 500 years ago, when this whole project gets going in Western Europe, race is one of those categories that's used to identify populations who can be done away with, basically, without being murdered, right? So, like, how can you take stuff from people without offending God's law in a Christian universe? Well, these are when theories of racial difference start to be born, and we need to understand that. So it's not, while I'm deeply appreciative of people's feelings of frustration around this, and the idea that kind of white people are being decultured or just dumped into some big group, that's actually the opposite of what we're saying. 500 years ago, none of your ancestors would have thought of themselves as white, not a single one. It wouldn't have made any sense to anybody. Whiteness was not a thing. Whiteness is a construction of our modern capitalist, imperialist birthed world, and we need to grapple with it, I think, in that very specific historical, social, political context.
Thanks for that, Alex. Just as Alex was talking, I'm reminded one of the things that we did when we launched our book, Frequently Asked White Questions, was we came up with a playlist on Spotify of just wicked tunes that also kind of like speak to a lot of these. And there's a song by a white rapper named Brother Ali that Alex put on the playlist that I listen to it all the time. It's called Before They Called You White, Before You Were White. And it just does a great job of linking that. And even when like I remember I was hanging out with Robbie Shilliam, a good friend of mine, international relations theorist, a very light-skinned, white-presenting black man, Rastafari, and he has done a really close reading of Marx, among many other things. And I remember him sharing, when Marx and Engels were writing in the 19th century, and they said, "Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." It wasn't just for poetic license, right? It was the understanding that like whiteness as this sort of industrial invention is really what kept certain groups of people who were laboring in the factories of Europe away from the servitude of the plantations. So there's an evocative kind of reminder about how close the white working class could actually be to the principles of servitude, because of course, especially in the 19th century, there is no reason why any working class white person would believe that their overlords would not enslave them, down the road. And it's the invention of whiteness that helped to create and consolidate this perception of differences. So the next question we have is something that I probably should have, I meant to talk about this, but I got flustered when we got started. So the question will speak for itself. How do Indigenous people feel about land acknowledgements made at the beginning of events and in email signatures? I acknowledge the importance of wording issues, but it sometimes feels automatic and empty, where words are not supported by actions. I'm an immigrant, non-white, and I might not be understanding the historical context and emotional value of it, as I've heard that this was something that was denied for a very long time. I also understand that Indigenous people are not one entity, where everyone thinks the same, but I've never get to hear what Indigenous communities think about it. So to answer that question, you're not going to hear what an Indigenous community thinks about it coming from the two of us, because we're not Indigenous either. But what I would say on the subject is that if you spend some time hanging out in Indigenous solidarity groups, and there's lots of good ones in Vancouver, that's actually where I first started learning about race and history, was just as a, I wasn't even a student. I was just a dude who lived in Vancouver around the time leading up to the Vancouver Olympics. And I started hanging out with Indigenous-led movements, organizing against VANOC at the time. And the amount of things that I learned, including like land acknowledgements and how this was all operating, was absolutely enormous. Not surprisingly, I think learning about this from Indigenous people while engaged in supporting Indigenous sovereignty movements and Indigenous solidarity groups, organizing with people who may not always be Indigenous, is a really valuable way to get this kind of education. In terms of land acknowledgements in general, it's true. Like, it has been and continues to be really challenging for fragile white Canadians to hear historically accurate statements about this country. And that's really part of the operation of nationalism and the operation of settler colonial nationalism. I wrote an article about this back in 2019 called Pathological White Fragility and the Canadian Nation, which I'd recommend maybe checking that one out, because it kind of does a deep dive into the kind of nationalistic reasons for this. But keeping to the spirit of the question about Indigenous land acknowledgements, I would say that Hayden King is a person that you should read. Hayden King was one of the people who really kind of like helped make land acknowledgements a common thing, such that we see it all across the universities. And I heard an interview with Hayden King maybe 2 years ago on the subject. And what he said was that he, in hindsight, wishes that he had never done it. And why? Exactly the reasons that you're speaking to. People see it as a tick off the box, something that they can just read and then move on. Well, I mean, I don't think that you should be doing that. What my sense is, and what I do in my classes, my research, and my events, aside from this one, because I forgot to do a land acknowledgement, is to integrate the substance of that land acknowledgement into what it is that you're doing. In my case, that's a little bit easier because I study colonial state formation, right? So it's difficult to talk about colonial state formation without engaging with indigeneity. But if you're not making it substantively part of what you're doing, then it's lip service, and nobody needs any more lip service. And with that in mind, I do think, speaking to this point of solidarity building and getting involved with the local Indigenous movements in your area, this is the way in which I have learned here in Mi'kma'ki to understand myself as somebody who's grappling with and straddling the identities of being a citizen of Canada, an immigrant to Canada, then a citizen of Canada, and then now an immigrant to Mi'kma'ki. And when we realize that if you take Indigenous sovereignty serious, then this edifice of Canada is not truly a country in its own right, but rather more of like an imperial conglomeration of various types of nations, of which the Canadian nation is one. You get a totally different understanding of land, of geography, of politics, and of history. And I would encourage you to kind of go about it in that way. Alex?
Yeah, really wonderfully said, I think. Yeah, I mean, without action, land acknowledgements are just empty rhetoric, straight up. So, yeah, they've become a way, especially for sort of like liberal politics of respectability, to say, hey, I know I've gone online and I read the section of the guide that tells me which Indigenous nation all this stuff has been built on top of, and now I'm going to spit that out and move on with the rest of my day. And obviously that's not the intention, right? If you think of the land acknowledgement as something like a mantra you're repeating to yourself, that is a statement of conviction, a rhetorical device you use to remind yourself and others of a reciprocal relationship in which you exist and which you wish to deepen and dignify, then I think it's really cool. I used to use a land acknowledgement that I kind of cooked up on my own for all the events that I was organizing in Halifax, in Kishipuktuk, in Mi'kma'ki, and yeah, and it really centered me in it in a weird way. I used to say, I acknowledge the territory and the people who have custody of it. And then I would say, and for all those who, like me, are settlers in the room, I acknowledge our collective responsibility to learn to live with justice and dignity with the first inhabitants of these territories. And I always really like that, because it wasn't me speaking on behalf of Indigenous people. It was simply me identifying myself as a settler on these territories and saying that's how I begin to move forward, right? Just like as somebody who identifies as a cis man in my relationships, I move forward acknowledging the reality of patriarchy and misogyny and trying not to reproduce that in the context of my own lived relationship. It's only one piece, right? But it is a piece of that struggle, as long as that's not the place where you stop. And so much of our politics today is mediated by these kinds of forms of like seemingly powerful but ultimately empty representation. Like, oh, you support BLM, post a black square on your Insta account, you know, hashtag this. All that stuff is garbage nonsense, right? Like, it's just garbage nonsense. It doesn't get us any. In fact, it gives you the illusion of having done something when, in fact, what you're doing is performing a certain kind of virtuousness for the watching public, whatever that is, right? So, yeah, I mean, I've met and spoken with Indigenous people who hate land acknowledgements, who hate it, especially when they're used in like she settler events, and other people who find it a respectable thing. And I think, you know, the only way you ever figure that out is by entering into relationships with people around you who are trying to struggle to make the world a better place, and then take your guideposts from them. Back to you, AJ.
Thanks, Alex.
Again.
You did again. Terrible, terrible. Two things came up again. I'm abusing my position as the person who's kind of leading off to always add footnotes, but here's a couple more footnotes. I also wanted to say something about the fact that the person who asked that question self-identified as an immigrant of color. And as another kind of immigrant of color, one thing that I found through engaging with the local Indigenous sovereignty-based movements in my areas and the various parts that I've lived in, I've been in Coast Salish territories, Algonquin territories, and Mi'kmaq territories. And in particular, the stuff in the last 5 years here in Mi'kma'ki, what took me by surprise was that simply by being present and by doing the work of supporting these Indigenous movements, I've been able to kind of bear witness to other people who are clearly trying to reconnect through the land with cosmologies that they are estranged from because of the processes of empire. And what surprised me was I didn't expect to kind of feel in my body and in my emotions that I myself actually have been separated from my land-based traditions and cosmologies. And that's in no way, shape, or form to suggest that I'm Indigenous. That's not my point. But what I realized is that a lot of the traditions that I grew up with as a small child in Trinidad and Tobago, in the Hindu community, things like earth worshiping and the integration of flowers and waters and the natural world as the centerpiece of all that we do. And then seeing Mi'kmaq grandmothers doing exactly the same thing, albeit in a different way, really connected with me in a sense that I can actually figure out who I am and what I've left behind by learning to love and appreciate Mi'kmaq land and defend Mi'kmaq land alongside the land and water defenders. And it's really been transformative in that sense. And I think that that's something that for those of us who are now away from whatever our traditional lands might be, we can take heart in that. And I would also add that this is something that I've also seen a lot of white allies doing in a good way. There's always people who are doing things not in a good way, but this is, I've seen people doing this in a good way. And then one other kind of pop culture reference on land acknowledgements is, of course, Baroness von Sketch. If you haven't seen the Baroness von Sketch bit on land acknowledgements, treat yourself to a Google search after this. I see somebody has. Next question comes from a faculty member, and we know this because it's written like an essay. Takes one to know one, guys. So I'm gonna paraphrase this. It's about decolonization of the curriculum as an institutional goal and a desire to make things practical. And the real ask of the question with a lot of context is, what advice do you have for faculty members who are pursuing curricular changes, personal growth, and on-the-job learning in the context of sometimes challenging debates and sometimes fraught relations that surround decolonization? Also, what advice do you have for colleagues and institutional initiatives about how best to create an encouraging and supportive environment for instructors who are pursuing these avenues of growth and change? A really wonderful, thoughtful question. So, you know, we've been involved in different kinds of things like this, right? To some extent, I would say creating an EDI committee is maybe not necessarily the best way to go, in part because what ends up happening is that if it's not done correctly, then you just end up burdening people with a lot of work, educating people who and not really benefiting from it. That said, you can do it in a thoughtful way. One of the things that I've thought would be very useful is, for example, if you have a generative policy committee doing equity and diversity work, and then you have an implementation committee separate, maybe comprised of people who self-identify or are identified as, you know, white cis males, heterosexual males, or something like that, to actually do the policy work, not of developing the policy, but of implementing it. Then that might be, in some sense, separating like the ideas generation that you need from people with the lived experience, and then having people who don't have that lived experience learn about it practically by trying to implement it in the institutional way. I've seen this work really well. I have some amazing like cis white male friends who similarly have tried to think, what is my role in the university right now? And they've said, and they've acted on this with great efficiency, to say, my role is to try to create institutional initiatives to allow other people to flourish for a while. And you know, it's kind of amazing. They just sit there quietly doing this work, and it makes a difference. So I definitely think there is a lot of stuff that folks can do to try and bring that, and it involves building up a level of racial competency and racial comfort, the ability to engage with these difficult conversations. And the question, you know, about how do you end up doing this? For me, what's worked for me has been just being honest about it. And I know that that's sometimes harder for pre-tenure people. I've definitely gotten into a world of problems and hurt in my pre-tenure days, doing things that I just thought was right. And I don't want to be like on my high horses here or something, but like, you know, it matters if you're doing things because they're the right things to do, and having like difficult conversations. We talk about in the book, there's a thinly veiled story from when I used to work for the federal government. I spelt my name Yaja, so nobody would know that I was actually using Ajay. And I was just talking about having this like epic fight with my supervisor, who thought that they should rip apart. I was working for the Canada Border Services Agency, and the policy under issue was, you know, if we want to find contraband, look for all the Sikh drivers and then tear apart their trucks because they're all smuggling stuff. And this was coming from my boss, and I was part of a research team. I was the only visible minority on the research team, and I laughed at first, and I was like, "You got to be joking! What kind of nonsense is this?" And he was serious. And I had to get into a shouting match with my boss, literally saying what escalated it to the end was, how do you think writing a turban hunt into Canadian law is going to look? It actually took down that. Like, I had to call him like that he was going on a turban hunt, because he was going on a turban hunt, you know, like, so that was, you know, that was like 20, not quite 20 years ago. The kinds of things that people are encountering in the workplace may not be quite that bold-faced, right? But what we wrote about in the book was not this obvious kind of racial competition that we had to have there, but the kind of useless reactions of everybody that I worked with on that team, right? They just kind of shuffled around, they didn't look at their feet, they didn't do anything. And then they all came afterwards and said, you know, that was a real hard conversation. I'm glad you had that. And, you know, thanks for doing it. And then I quit my job, right? I was like, I don't want any part of the government of Canada. So that was the outcome. So if you don't want outcomes like that, I think it's really important to force yourself into these fights, particularly those of you who have the protection of tenure, and just say, you know, that I'm going to have really some tough feelings about this and I can work it out. I mean, honestly, if you this is going to sound weird, but if you have coverage in your collective agreement for things like therapy, psychoanalysis, that sort of thing, they're there to use. And it can help you in ways that are really transformative as you grapple with these kind of difficult things. Alex?
Yeah, great comments, AJ. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would really just kind of double down on most of what Ajay said, and then maybe add one thing. And but one thing I want to add is I recognize this question is about decolonization and the institution and the curriculum. But I would say, again, I mean, just as something I tell myself often, but something we often confront when we get questions from, frankly, from the professional managerial class, who is us, right? From the white professional class, or sorry, the white collar professional class, flip of the tongue there, is that don't only locate your social justice aspirations in your wage work. Like there is a tendency amongst professors and those like us, especially when we come from like intergenerational reproduction of our class structure, that really elevates our work life. It's like everything important is going on in the university, right? So this is the site of struggle, and it really isn't. Like we could get on to this more and more, but like, you're gonna have to take my word for that. So there's lots to be done inside the university, and there's lots to be done elsewhere. And I just think that that balance has to be achieved, and in our own lives as well. And sometimes when you have that balance, you feel less frustrated by the incredible bureaucratic nightmare that is the modern capitalist university. Frankly, that's not to say you shouldn't work in that space to change it, make it better, but sometimes when all your energies are focused there, it can be really soul destroying. So just think about, like where does this problem live in the world? I'm looking to decolonize life here in Halifax. How can I do that in a way that I'm doing that on a daily basis and pushing it forward, sometimes in really like mundane ways, right? In my own life, in my own experience outside of my role as a professor. But I also think that speaks to the second thing I wanted to raise here, which is, if you're trying to convince colleagues or people in the institution who are less friendly to these ideas that they're worth investing in, their own time, their effort, their support, then like think about framing it less as, here is our attempt to integrate indigenous perspectives or to make room for, but that this is actually a struggle for collective liberation, right? Like, so we all get freer as we let go of those hierarchical, unjust, and oppressive relationships that turn some of us into perpetrators and other people into victims, right? So like I get freer as I let go of those of that right to dominate, of that right to occupy. Like that's not a great place to be in. Nobody should really crave that kind of status all the time and what it does to your humanity, right? So I just think that's a really productive way of looking at it. If you're trying to find persuasive ground upon which to build an argument to colleagues who are cynical about the stuff. And my third point is to really reinforce what Ajay had to say about this. I think it is really important for those of us with security and status to actually just be humble and do the work. And I frankly see this too rarely amongst my colleagues. Lots of talk, lots of rhetoric. Everybody wants to be seen, to be saying the right thing, but fewer people want to do the humble work of just, of writing the policy, of submitting it to that committee, of being the advocate for it, not being the tip of the spear or the spokesperson or the dude who's invited to speak at the rally or the senator who gets to get up and pontificate in front of the Senate, but the person who like grammar and spell checks the submission to undergraduate curriculum committee or whatever, the person who nominates something, who pushes something forward. So if you are somebody with some institutional cachet, how about minimizing yourself and actually making yourself the foundation rather than the most public part of that struggle? And then what was my final point on this? Yeah, I would say those are the things I would say, right? I'm not going to say any more about that. I think that covers my 2 points, actually. Back to you, Ajay.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from a self-identified faculty member who says, how would you suggest identifying identity or racial, how would you suggest approaching identity or racial tensions that come up between students in the classroom? For example, a student who's strongly anti-X, actively ignoring and not engaging with a student who is X. Yeah, I mean, that's a challenging question, right? I think to some extent it depends on who X is, because the nature of these identities produce particular outcomes, right? Like, is in this scenario, is one of the students' humanity being denied by the other, right? In which case this is, like, to some extent a classroom management question about, like, no, you don't have a right to deny the humanity of another member of the class. And it can be as simple as kind of shutting that down without making too big of a deal of it, you know. And where, like, when I read this, like, I think obviously back on different things that I've experienced, and big flare-ups around this tend to come when there's, like, really heated context, right? Like Tamil and Sinhalese students in my classrooms. I teach a class called Empire, War, and Resistance in Sri Lanka. It understandably will bring people on various, with really, like, representing two quite polar different worldviews. And we have to kind of, when you're teaching, for example, about a context of, like, ongoing military abuse and civil war and nationalism more than anything, because then, like, what I go to with students in that context is I take them back to the history, show them how, you know, you think that you are essentially different on these sorts of things, but how do you contend with the fact that there's historical and archaeological evidence that shows, you know, in this predominantly Sinhalese part of the country, there's obviously, like, Tamil relics here and Hindu relics. And this ostensibly Tamil only area, there's all this presence of Sinhalese culture. The fact that, you know, and I'm being very specific here, right? Like, maybe your issue is not about the Sri Lankan Civil War, but it might very well be about, you know, Russia and Ukraine, right? This is something that we're going to be seeing a lot of tensions about probably in our classrooms. It could be about gender identity and heteronormativity. So it kind of depends. I think if somebody's humanity is being called into question, to some extent, your pedagogical obligations in the classroom have to take a second base to your role as the manager of the classroom, to say, no, you can't deny the humanity of others. Palestinian and Israeli students oftentimes have this problem. And then the secondary part is trying to look for those teachable moments, and they may not come right away. And what I've found is actually handy is to be honest with my students about that in the classroom and be like, we need to acknowledge that this thing is happening. You're probably feeling it right now in your bodies and certainly in your minds. All the students who are being quiet are also being witness to this sort of thing. And say, we, like, you know, let's take 5 minutes and come back to this, and give yourself the break to actually do that. You know, I just started all my classes yesterday, and I'm teaching a course on the global history of capitalism. And I decided to write a content warning for the class. And at the bottom of the content warning, I was basically just saying, look, the material here is going to be controversial and deeply jarring at times. And I think that you should take care of yourself by reading ahead and stepping out as you need to. And then I added, and I'm going to do the same thing too, because this stuff is also enormously triggering to me as I have to teach it to you. And it resonated with students in a really powerful way, because they kind of saw me in alliance with them, as opposed to some expert at the front of the room who stands above from all of these kinds of problems, right? That speaks to, I think, part of the problem of the academy as it's rolled out historically has been the presentation of the professor as someone above the masses, you know, the unlettered rabble, or however you want to put it. And really, if you consider the classroom as a more egalitarian space, then that has to extend both ways, right? And we're humans too. So embracing your humanity and role modeling what that looks like to the students, I think, can be a really powerful thing. Alex?
Great examples for sure, and a very good question. Although I think, as Ajay points out, maybe a little bit hard to answer in all of its specifics in the abstract, right? Because I mean, we all have, as faculty, lots of students who just refuse to engage, and you don't know why a lot of the time, right? There's nothing to do about it. Maybe they're bored, maybe they haven't come prepared. But I'm assuming from the framing of your question that it's clear that they're refusing to engage as a result of like the state of being of another person, student in the classroom. And yeah, I really can't agree anymore with Ajay on this point. Like, if that was clear to me, then that's just an issue of human dignity. You know, you don't. I would pull that student who was refusing to engage aside at the end of class and have an open, honest, supportive, but ultimately like unapologetic conversation with them about their behavior and about their willingness to recognize the humanity of a person in the room. You know, that would be where I would start, I think. But I also imagine situations that are much more ambiguous than this. And I had one last year, maybe the year before, in my intro class, and we were, you know, this is a 60-person class. We're talking with I was talking with students about issues of race and racism, and we were doing group work, and I forget the prompt that I set them, but it was something like, you know, what do you think about the state of you know, racial relationships in our society? I don't know, something very lame and neutral like that. And we're going around the classroom, and there was one group I got to, and it was, you know, just to be clear, it was a group of all young, clearly white women. And you know, historically, I would say this is not a group of people that I would expect to be reluctant to engage, right? Often, you know, students like this, I work at an institution that's overwhelmingly women identified. 20% of our students are women. And I said, I'm like, did you not understand the question? And again, they were quiet. I did that whole thing, counting to 10 in my head, gave them space, nothing. I was, what's going on here? I actually looked around the room at one point. I was like, am I muted? Can you not hear me? And yeah, sure enough, when I gave them a little bit of time, one of the students eventually piped up and just said in this really quiet voice, she's like, I don't see color. I don't see color. And it was just this really interesting moment where, you know, like I could see their collective and certainly her individual anxiety, like couldn't have been clearer. Their discomfort, their desperate wish that this conversation would end and that I would turn to somebody else and that we could talk about something else. But without calling them out, I was, you know, I really wanted to use that moment as a way to pry this open, because this is, you know, the kind of liberal politic nonsense that we get introduced to. Like, oh, the best thing you could do as a white person in the society is to pretend everybody's just like you. You don't see race. We're all this, like, what utter nonsense, right? Like that just reduces people's histories, their family histories, their, you know, their world history to nothing. It flattens it, makes it invisible, says all that brought you here, the reason you're here, that your family went through what it did, that you know, struggled, suffered, been elevated, whatever. It's all meaningless, and you're just a number in the system, and that's not fair to anybody at all in that, right? So just, I think, acknowledging that often silence or discomfort or even that kind of like weird cold hostility that you get sometimes when people enter into conversation, that's often not from anger necessarily. It's from this deep and overriding insecurity that people have, that Ajay talks about all the time, in terms of like this inability. This is something that, you know, white people are organized into white supremacy. They're organized into this lack of racial resilience, so that any discussion of this structure of white supremacy becomes like this personal, deeply seated source of anxiety, right? Which is a convenient way also of protecting it as the kernel one of the organizing logics of our society, right? Making sure that the majority of us can't ever have a decent conversation about it because it fills us with such terror and anxiety and frustration that we try to advance past it as soon as possible. But of course, in doing that, we never actually begin to have the conversations we need to get beyond the place where we're at. Back to you, AJ.
Thanks for that, Alex. Our next question says a question about our education system. The new guidelines suggest that hormone therapy can be started as young as 16 years old for teenagers who identify as transgender. If we do not allow teenagers to drink until 21 and smoke until the age of 18, why does the education system permit teenagers to receive treatment that can permanently impact the rest of their lives while they are still in a phase of identity uncertainty? So there's a lot to say about this question. So first of all, in Canada, I think the highest drinking age is 19. So just on a technical point, 19-year-olds and then sometimes 18-year-olds drink in Canada. But I think the bigger issue here, just a couple of big issues here. One of the big issues that I'll start with here is, maybe the issue is we should be lowering the age of consent in a lot of different ways, because think about the other things that you can do when you're 16. And I believe it's in Alberta and parts of the prairies, you can start learning how to drive when you're 14 or 15 years old, get your learner's license when you're 16 and operate a motor vehicle capable of, being a massive weapon, as we've seen, unfortunately, in this country, or just through, general incompetence. You can hurt people and other people. You can purchase a gun and you can register that gun that you can be used to do tremendous acts of violence as like a 14 or maybe I think 16-year-old. There are a lot of things like I'd absolutely think that we should be lowering the voting age, right? Like it's probably absurd that the voting age is 18, especially when you spend any time hanging out with 16-year-olds. I remember my first time speaking in public. I was 15 or 16 and I was making this passionate argument that we need to lower the voting age to 16. Because it was absolutely infuriating as a teenager. I'm many decades removed from the experience of being a teenager, but what I do know is that when I talk to teenagers and when I talk to little kids who understand that they're transgender or that they don't fit the way that society is perceiving them, they know what they're talking about in ways that is actually oftentimes quite startling to me as an adult. And when you look at the statistics about this sort of thing, it's like the absolute extreme minority of kids actually feel that they wish they didn't go down that road. There is like that we have to be cognizant of, again, the way in which the right and also religious communities get duped by the right in terms of turning what is essentially a non-issue and a medical issue and an issue of fundamental human rights into a kind of existential, won't someone think about the children issue. Children know things a lot more than we give them credit for. And just like, I mean, obviously the person who phrased this question, and thank you for the question, because it gives us a chance to talk about this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that the person posing this question is not struggling with their gender identity. And I don't struggle with my gender identity, but when I talk to people who have overcome that in society, the one thing that they always tell me is like, listen, even if you're 4 years old, if who you identify as doesn't match the way everybody sees you. That's just the thing that and then you just have it like buried down on top of you and you carry it and you have nobody to talk to about it. And then eventually at some point, hopefully, if you're lucky, you get to do something about it. So my take on this is like this: don't confuse smoking and drinking with kind of the gentle kinds of medical assistance that we can offer to young people to help correct what is basically something society and the people closest to them, the trauma that they have done to these innocent kids. And don't confuse that with like the weaponization of like, whatever it is, alcohol or guns and what have you. Don't be deceived by that. And it relates to the next question, but I'll pass it to Alex first.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I don't ever mistake the state's regulation of various forms of behavior as like my yardstick for morality or social good. Yeah, the state regulates all kinds of things. Thinks you can do all sorts of things. Has no problem with, for example, people being left houseless. Has no problem with like decades of boil water advisories on indigenous land territory. Has no problem, with some wars or picking some politicians out of office while supporting. Like the state does all sorts of things in the interest of the ruling class that I don't take as my yardstick for how society ought to work, and I would say neither should you. Um, does that mean we need to support any particular intervention? No, and I think fair enough. This is a conversation to have. Maybe if we lived, as Ajay is pointing out, in a more humane, more dignified social order that didn't have this like both hilarious and awful and destructive and anti-human notion of a gender binary where you only get to choose one or the other, because there are only two ways of being in the world, then we wouldn't need other forms of intervention, right? Like, I don't know, maybe young people who are seeking gender affirming care, maybe fewer of them would need to transition physically if they felt they were allowed to be more fluid in their identification. I don't know, because I've always been a cis guy and I fit easily into that binary, and so that's not my experience to speak for. But I acknowledge the fact that hormone therapy is not something that's been cooked up by a bunch of anarchists in somebody's basement. These are medical professionals who are weighing in on this, right? So, I mean, I don't know. Do you take meds for anxiety? Do you go to your doctor when you feel unwell and get prescribed something? Do you seek like life affirming care from people with relevant credentials? Well, it is people with those relevant training and credentials who are not, by and large, like, I don't know if you know many doctors or psychiatrists, but they're not exactly planning the revolution, most of them, right? That's not to crap on my colleagues in medicine, okay? Lots of them have great social justice commitments, but it's not exactly the tip of the revolutionary spirit here. So part of what gets us going in this is this conspiratorial thinking around their intervention here that the right has weaponized so easily. It's also around this issue of so-called parental rights, as if our kids are our property, our chattel property, and that you have to get my permission. I have two kids, and I don't support this notion of parental rights any more than I think schools as institutions ought to be allowed to pontificate whatever like bit of state sanctioned ideology that they're being vested with, right? So like we're just in the midst of a very big conversation about like how we can be in the world. And I suppose I would just encourage you to think generously about the fact that people's experiences don't fit into either or categories. I'm sure most of yours don't. If you look back over your life, regardless of how easily you fit into like the kind of dominant structure of society, I'm sure you've had times when you've had experiences that weren't validated or heard, where you were dismissed, despite the fact that you were living through something that felt incredibly real and vital to you, where a bureaucratic agency with real power over your life simply dismissed it because you weren't presenting whatever it was, whether it was an insurance claim, your dog ate your homework, you're like whatever, you missed a flight because there was an accident on the road and you couldn't get to the airport, like any number of things where you're like, please, this is my existence, I'm not lying to you, stop treating me in this like bureaucratic cookie cutter way. Well, I would just like flip that back around and say, why would you assume that these people are like, what is their game? What's the long game of trans youth who are advocating for themselves and trying to find a way to be in this world that actually has nothing to do with your life whatsoever? They don't want you. They're not trying to convert you. They're not trying to change your sexuality or gender identity, but they're speaking from an honest place like what's the long game there? And that invites probably conspiracy theorists to spew all sorts of nonsense at me. I don't want it. That's why I'm not on social media anymore. But I will just say that, you know, I think like we keep coming back to, right? There is responsibility here if you are not up against the cutting edges of the people who have found themselves there. That doesn't mean you have to defer to them on everything, but it means when it comes to their life experience and they're telling you something about that, you should listen. Back to you, AJ.
Thanks, Alex. I'm cognizant of the time. I think we've got time to slide in one more question. There's a quick one here, sort of, and as much as any of these can be quick questions, because I know you all have someplace to be at 2:15, which is your 10:15. So the last question for today, and then Alex will kind of answer it and then kind of sign us off as we tend to do. So the last question is, I feel like Pierre Poilievre and the type of society he is advocating for is racist. It's just a feeling that I have, but I struggle with articulating as to why. Am I way off base here? Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. It's just, I mean, I think my answer to this question is it may well be, right? It may well be that the society that Pierre Poilievre and his party, what they represent it may be that they're racist. But the bigger question, and the bigger problem, I think, that we're seeing in Canadian society is in the way in which Poilievre and that kind of ilk are defending structural white supremacy as a legitimate way of understanding Canada and Canadian norms, as an entitlement, as something that Canadians ought to be entitled to, and more importantly, how they are able to effectively conscript people of color into that narrative. So it is actually a much bigger issue than is Poilievre racist? Probably not. I don't care really what an individual race and racism, when it matters, generally speaking, is the most is as a structure of power. It's not about whether or not some asshole is, you know, a racist. They may well be, but that's not going to change anything. But when they are defending and advocating for a way of understanding the world grounded in the structural white supremacy that are, you know, like our book and our work and that of like so many other people tries to make visible, that's the problem. And that's the genesis of the pushback. It has been the relative gains of movements like Black Lives Matter, of Idle No More, of all the various Indigenous land defenses, of you know, organizations defending the rights of temporary foreign workers in this country from the indentureship-like circumstances that they live in. This has slightly pushed society towards a more progressive way. And the backlash around that has been, no, we want society of, you know, the Harper government was talking about this right before they got booted, right? Old stock Canadians. We want things the way that they are. It's when people lay claim to defending a society simply as it is, as if there were no historical, economic, and political conditions that led to that creation, that's when we really need to be afraid and concerned. And Poilievre is polling, last polls I saw was upwards of 38-39%, which in this country is whopping majority government. And the last thing waiting to like kind of cinch it for him, at least in terms of polling data, is actually white women. That was also the demographic that delivered Trump or didn't deliver Trump. So it's a very important specific demographic to be thinking about. And then the bigger issue is like, you know, how can we ensure that Poilievre and others who are, you know, kind of trying to present themselves as conservative progressives, despite the contradiction in term, how can we make sure that they don't trick people? And it's not necessarily because I care about electoral politics. It's actually because I care about people actually being informed and acting with agency in the world. Whether or not it's one government or the other isn't going to fundamentally change most people's lives. It'll change the conditions of our struggles. But anyway, yeah, with that, I'll pass it to Alex for the last word.
Yeah, thanks for that. Great question. I'm actually going to put in a shameless plug for an article I wrote last year in December. You can find it online on Beat Media. It's called How the Left Can Reclaim Freedom from Pierre Poilievre. And yeah, I talk a lot about right-wing populism in that. I think, you know, all around the world, but especially across the overdeveloped capitalist global north, we see far-right populism rising and really surging, you know, amongst people who are rightly disaffected by the status quo. And, you know, I have no sympathy for the Trudeau-led Liberals. This is a textbook example of basically an incompetent ruling class making room for a much more muscular, at times violent, certainly reactionary right to seize the day on a bunch of issues that they could have well led on, right? That would have improved everybody's lives, that have nothing to do with so-called culture wars or woke politics, but, you know, represented by failure to reform the electoral system, to deal with the, you know, cost of living, to deal with a housing crisis, like what, you know, a few weeks ago, right? Like we're in a university setting here, Trudeau's blaming international students for the housing crisis in Canada, right? Like who is setting the stage for the rise of the right here? Anyway, into all this toxic mess enters Poilievre, and I'm sure if you asked him, he'd say, "Of course I'm not racist," because his wife is non-white, right? So these are the kinds of cards they play. I actually don't think he's racist, straight up. You know, I've looked at his background and I've looked at his videos. He's certainly a dyed-in-the-wool right-wing populist, and he represents interests that are decidedly white supremacist, as Ajay has so well pointed out. Like what we're talking about here is not sort of like him being a vehicle for some muckraking racism that's like, you know, tawdry and vulgar and right in your face. Rather, he represents an attempt to, on the one hand, as Ajay points out, push back against some of the hard-earned victories, particularly social movements have won over the last few decades. But he also represents an attempt to capitalize on the anxiety, the frustration, the honest anger that people feel at the fate and state of the world. But in this moment, we have to, I think, you know, those of us who care about living in a better, more dignified, more just reality, have to push back against those easy answers. The problem is in moments of crisis, it is like the dominant narratives that tend to hold sway, right? People reach for what they know and what they can understand, and that reactionary populism, it offers all of that. It offers, look, if we just went back to before all these trans people making trouble, before Indigenous people were so uppity, before you had to worry about the jokes you could make in the workplace, before blah, blah, blah. This idea that there was once a golden age that we could return to. But if you look at history, my goodness, that golden age is so very limited and so specific to the demographic that it rewarded, right? So let's just not be fooled by that. We need to not worry. Don't get into fighting culture war politics with people at the grassroots. Instead, understand what might be drawing them to the Conservatives right now, and to Poilievre in particular, is that frustration. We speak to those people by acknowledging their fears and issues, by trying to get to the root of what is creating those fears and issues, and by providing better, more humane, more collectively liberated alternatives to them, not by shaming, blaming, and, like, you know, creating little tribes of political loyalists that are willing to fight for either Trudeau and his Liberals, or Poilievre and the Conservatives, or whatever else. But thank you so much for this question. It's a good one to end on. Folks, we're so sorry that we have to leave you now, but this has been a great opportunity to be here with you. We hope you found it useful and interesting. We hope you found the book useful too. And we'll remind you that we're not going to forget about your questions in future episodes of Safe Space for White Questions. We will come back to them. So if you're interested in hearing our answers, we'd love to share them. Check back in with us. And thanks again for your wonderful hosting of us. And we hope the rest of your day goes just as well.
Thanks, everyone. Have lovely afternoons or mornings.